Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar series. We're pleased today to have a program hosted by Applied Materials. Some of the biggest areas of concern that we're hearing as a Chamber of Commerce here in Kalispell are regarding how do we protect our employees? What are the proper steps we should be taking with our customers as they come in and out? How should what we do vary by location? Some is more customer facing and some of it is more office oriented and so on. So we're very pleased today to have some of the experts at Applied Materials. I know as the president of the Kalispell Chamber, we've really leaned on their expertise in their places of work. They have such a safety of culture. They really stood out as an organization. We wanted to seek out for their advice and counsel as we visit with our 725 members of the Kalispell Chamber. So we'll be hosted today by Brian Aegerter. Brian is the local general manager of the business unit of Applied Materials here in Northwest Montana. He's also a member of the board of directors for the Kalispell Chamber and couldn't be more pleased to be working with you today, Brian, to co-host this with you and for you to share your expertise with the businessmen and women here of the Flathead Valley. And with that, Brian, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. We've been fielding quite a few questions lately to our Kalispell office from local businesses regarding, guidelines and input and questions and concerns relative to what it means to go back to work or moving back into normal. So as we have worked through that internally and with our applied corporate organization through our United States locations, one of the things that we realized is we developed a very good skeleton plan here, and we wanted to share that plan with you and some of the details today so that we could help all of you with questions or concerns or inputs that you have about how to get back to work. So the overriding guidance for our policy really is to follow local rules and regulations and then put our own twist on those. The most important thing that we need to pay attention to as employers as we look at bringing our people back to work and trying to return to normal is how do we develop and implement appropriate policies? And that's what we're going to focus on today. I think as we move through this, that's all that as employers you really need to think about is do the right thing, and doing the right thing may not necessarily mean following every letter of the law completely, but doing the best that you can to continue to keep people safe and importantly, keep your workers feel safe and productive. Next slide, please. So in terms of returning to work, the most important thing is to develop a game plan or a framework. And as we work through developing a game plan or a framework, we want to think about what are the important criteria and factors that are going to cause us to make decisions or even guide us as we move through this process. Some of us may want to use government regulations only, but there are also important considerations relative to each community in Montana. There are some communities in eastern Montana that are going to have completely different guidelines and policies. Those of us that are in a little bit heavier areas are going to see the need, or have the need rather, to think about what our community situation is. So as we developed our plan, we thought about many of these things, including what our local COVID status was within the valley here in our area. And we also thought we should think about things like schools and childcare, because we have a lot of employees, especially those hourly employees working on our production floor. And one of the things some of us who either have adult children or no children forget about is how difficult it is to have our employees thinking about their kids at home while they're in the facility trying to work or be productive for you. Also, then after you think about what factors and things are going to guide how you make your decisions, the other important thing is to think about what mitigations you're going to implement in place. In other words, what actions are you actually going to take to follow the guidelines and make things safe for not only your employees, but also for your customers. Some of the things that we think about, we'll talk about in a little more detail, are moving to flexible work schedules. We've been working at home for about 3 months almost now, or since January rather, since this thing first started, with our employees that were able to work remotely. And we've been able to come up with guidelines and policies and procedures to keep about 250 of our hourly manufacturer employees actually working continually with very little impact to our overall schedule. And that's because we thought really strongly about flexible work schedules. The other thing to think about is personal protective equipment. We'll go through that a little bit. And we also have employee screening. And there's different ways to do employee screening. And we'll work through with you some of the ideas that we've had relative to active and passive employee screening. So with us today, we have Ken Hanna, who will take over from here for the next few slides. Ken runs our Common Operations Group in Kalispell. After that, we have Chris Turner, who is our on-site environmental health and safety manager and who's done an outstanding job in driving a lot of these policies and employee screening and other things. And he's also the person that coordinates with our bigger groups throughout the United States. And then for Q&A periods, we thought we should have a couple of our H&R experts online. So we have Julie Blodgett, who's the director of our Human Resources group here in Montana, and then also Mary McLoy, who's our Human Resources business partner who runs our manufacturing portion of our HR group here in Montana. So with that, I'll pass it along to Ken, and we'll go through the slides here. And please make notes as we're going through this because we'd like to have your questions and answers at the end of the session. Okay, Ken?
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate the introduction. So at Applied Materials, when we saw COVID coming to the shores of the United States, we went ahead and activated our business continuity plan. And then subsequently, we wrote a phased-in escalation plan to deal with COVID-19 as it started to become a little bit more prevalent in the United States and started to spread through our communities. Some of the things we looked at as we wrote this plan were, what do we do about travel restrictions, quarantine? How do we adjust our in-person meetings? Obviously, we have a lot of customers that come into the building and vendors that come into our building, plus we just have a lot of employees. We had to look at how do we adjust those in-person meetings. Also, we took a really hard look, as Brian alluded to, on our workforce. As you can see, when we phased through this plan, we started encouraging work from home very quickly. That was in our phase 2 of our program. And then we went into a recommended work from home. And then ultimately where we ended up in phase 4 was a mandatory work from home, less the critical workforce or essential workforce on site. Additionally, we also looked at what do we do about health screening and how do we maintain our facility. As you see here, we ran a passive screening, which Chris will talk about in a few more slides. We ran a passive screening program, and that ultimately escalated into an on-site physical presence screening that we do before employees are allowed to enter the building. And subsequently, as we did that, we also took the number of visitors down to only business critical visitors getting into the building. So it was an approach that we took as we came into COVID-19, and we have being a fairly large organization, we had that luxury of having a business continuity plan and then very quickly being able to go into this phased approach to be able to keep our critical business open during these trying times. You go to the next slide, Chris. So with the governor's release of the shelter-in-place order in the state of Montana and the, again, criteria that he put out for reopening the state, we took a similar approach in how do we phase out of COVID-19 and get back to an all-clear or pre-COVID state. So we took the same type of approach going from a phase 4 down to a phase 3. And the first thing we took a look at were what are some of the governing criteria or trigger points that we would use to move from phase to phase. And in this, we took a look at what are the government regulations. Obviously, in phase 4, we were still sitting in a statewide shelter-in-place order. And then as we move into the subsequent phases, we're a little bit in reverse. Our phase 3 will move into Montana's phase 1 of the reopening of the economy, and then our phase 2 and phase 1 will coincide with Montana's phase 2 and phase 3. In addition to that, we had to create some sort of trigger points, what causes us to move from in between our phases, from our phase 4 to our phase 3 to our phase 2. There were no really governing guidelines in the Montana return to work order. So we kind of look at the national level and took a look at what is our county doing. And we've come to the conclusion that if we can maintain a 14-day period in the county with either declining, downward trajectory, or no new cases within a 14-day period, that was our all clear to move from phase to phase. That's not to say if we had 1 or 2 cases pop up that would back up a phase, but it may prolong our departure from, say, phase 2 into phase 3 or into phase 1. We also took a look at our quarantine and tried to understand what does quarantine look like coming out. And essentially, you know, the state of Montana is still maintaining the self-quarantine for anyone traveling into the state. So we recognize that, put it into our phases. Then we also realized that we don't want sick individuals coming into the workforce because we need to continue to stop the spread of COVID-19. So we just maintained a 14-day quarantine for any individuals that were confirmed or had a suspected case of COVID-19. But then on the human side, what Brian was also alluding to, we also needed to understand what does it mean for our workforce too. So we needed to understand what the schools are doing. And obviously this just showed up this morning as School District 5 voted last evening to maintain active distance learning for the remainder of the school year. But we're also looking at what did the schools do and what is our childcare situation in the Valley. So those are all the governing or the trigger points that we looked at as we start to phase back out of our COVID-19 current state. Go to the next slide, Chris. So once we understood the criteria or those trigger mechanisms, we also wanted to look at a mitigation plan. Good. One too many there, Chris. We also wanted to look at what are our mitigation actions for coming out of the current state of COVID-19. The things we looked at as we phased out were, again, quarantine. What is our visitor policy? Just so like we escalated into it, we disallowed visitors into the building. We had to look at what our visitor policy is coming back out of COVID-19. How many visitors and when do we let them in the building? Personal protective equipment, as Brian alluded to, is very important to us too. So we, again, put a mitigation plan and recommendations for each phase of what level of personal protective equipment that we will be offering and suggesting that our employees use. In addition, we, as we phased in, we ramped up our cleaning of high frequency cleaning of common touch points. That's maintained throughout the entire phase. But again, employee screening was really important to us as we ramped in, got all the way up to active screening. You'll see here as we ramp back down, we're taking a little bit more of a conservative approach, and we'll maintain active screening much longer as we phase out of COVID-19. And then we'll talk a little bit later about a bullet point you'll see in here where we're actually going to maintain some temperature screening all the way through phase 2 and have that available at any given time in the future. We'll talk about that in a few slides going forward. And then we also really took a serious look at face-to-face meetings and social distancing. What does that mean as we come out of each phase and into the next phase? Obviously, we followed the Montana regulations or the Montana guidelines in our phase 3 and phase 2 of not having more than 10 or 30 people in any given area where social distancing couldn't be allowed. But we also really took a look at, okay, let's try and maintain 6 feet wherever possible. Where we can't maintain 6 feet, let's really highly suggest PPE be used in those conditions. And as we reintroduce workforce, we're also taking a look at, do we need our conference rooms, or can we go ahead and continue the distance work that we've been doing from home for the last several months, as Brian had alluded. So we're actually keeping our conference rooms closed through our phase 3. And even when we enter our phase 2, we're only going to have 50% occupancy of each conference room. So we're really taking a close look and keeping a good eye on how we populate the building, how close we are to each other, how clean we keep the building, everything it's going to take to keep COVID-19 knocked down to the level we are today in the Flathead Valley. You go ahead and go to the next slide, Chris. Then lastly, we are also tracking, and it's really important to us to understand, how much headcount are we introducing into the building? As Brian has alluded, we got about 260 people that we're able to maintain in our facilities through our critical workforce. Those are the people that have to be on site, that have hands-on jobs. And as we enter into our next phase, we're only going to increase that headcount by about 20 people. We're taking a very soft approach at it. And then as we enter into phase 2, hopefully just a couple of weeks after we enter to phase 3, we'll introduce about another 100. And then finally, as we enter phase 1, we'll have pretty much a full workforce back at the building, and we'll enter about another 100 people. So a very methodical, phased approach at coming back to a fully occupied building and a complete workforce here in the facilities we occupy. The other thing that we're taking a look at, and we'll be guided a little bit by some corporate guidance, is what does our business travel look like? And we've taken a pretty hard stance at keeping our business travel knocked down to a bare minimum up until the point that we enter our phase 1. and we start allowing, again, international travel and U.S. travel throughout the continental U.S. to our customers, pretty much maintaining it to business critical only wherever needed.
And a lot of that comes from kind of our social responsibility, we feel, to keep, you know, not only our employees who are traveling to those sites safe, but we also want to reduce the opportunity for one of our employees to bring something back here, you know, especially if we're on a downward trend within the valley for, you know, an incident case standpoint.
Yeah, thanks. Great point, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Ken and Brian. So the next thing we'd like to do is kind of take the governor mandate and break that down into the different sections and talk about some of the site-specific stuff we've done here locally in Kalispell or Applied Materials, and give you guys some lessons learned, some things that we found out that worked well or didn't work well, and just try to kind of share some of our learning experience. So both Ken and Brian already touched quite a bit on our work from home policy. You know, the number one way to keep your workplace safe and your employees operating is to, you know, obviously minimize the number of people that are in the building. So we focused really hard on that business critical folks only on site. We identified who our essential employees in and made sure that we only had those folks in the building, and that the folks that didn't need to be here, that they were doing what they could from home, and so we can maintain the operation in that manner. In addition, workforce separation and social distancing, a lot of different ways that you can do that. Obviously, dividing your employees and providing that separation as much as possible. For us, we use the CDC guidance for 6 feet. So we go out and had our managers and our employees look at the operations and identify those areas where we had trouble maintaining that 6 foot of separation. And then we put alternative control measures into place. And some examples of that are putting dividers in place to separate your employees. It's basically a piece of plexiglass to kind of separate two employees that had to work side by side. And we could separate through that distancing protocol. Splitting your shifts, we really struggled with a couple of our areas, specifically inventory, where we have fixed racking that you can't move around. So we had a pretty good sizable crew in there that's moving parts around, taking shipments in, and we actually had to split that group into 2 different nights to allow for us to maintain that social distancing in that tighter area. Another great example of how you were able to do that is working around your schedules a little bit. For us in our lab ops, we went to a 4-on, 4-off schedule, which allows us to work some folks on the weekends, but with the 4-on, 4-off, they don't have to work every weekend. So basically, we were able to split our exposure in half, or our crew in half, but still get them in the doors and do the work that they need to that was critical inside our lab environment. And then another example that we're looking at as we phase back in is our office staff. So we've talked about, again, splitting that group up. Maybe you have half your group come in on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the other group come in on a Tuesday, Thursday. And again, it's keeping as many of the employees as you can outside of your workplace so that you have a safer work environment for those that you absolutely need in there to maintain your business operations. Let's see. Also just want to talk briefly about, the governor mandate makes references to making special accommodations for members of a vulnerable population or those with vulnerable household members. This was really big for us in the early stages as we were looking at our employees that had either at-risk family members at home or they themselves were at risk. So make sure you spend some time identifying those folks in your workplace and then making accommodations however possible through your flexible work schedules. All right, social distancing and PPE. Like we mentioned before, social distancing we've kind of identified as that 6 feet rule. The governor directive mentions in there closing common areas or enforcing strict social distancing requirements. So for us, we did go through and closed a number of different areas, as Ken had mentioned, that were low frequency use or no longer needed with a lot of the office staff not in the building. So all our conference rooms have been closed. We did close a number of our little break rooms. A lot of areas where employees congregated and we didn't need those, We had watering stations and manufacturing floor. We eliminated a lot of those. So just looking at all those things where you have employees coming together either on breaks or during their lunch periods, and if they're not needed, go ahead and close those up. One thing that we do in those situations, and even in our office areas, we identify those with some signage. As we talk a little bit about cleaning, you want to make sure you're not cleaning areas that don't need to be cleaned. So we've identified those throughout the building so we don't double up on some of the cleaning. Strict social distancing guidelines, just an example up there, that's actually my office. I have a lot of people coming in and asking questions, wanting information. So we've used this red X mark in different areas, including some of our screening process where, hey, that's where the 6 feet is. Don't come any closer unless you got PPE on. So that's just one example of some of the things we can do from a social distancing standpoint. And then we've already talked about the gathering of large groups. And again, this is out of the governor mandate. Avoid gathering large groups of more than 10 people. So those are the kind of the gatherings that you want to take a good hard look at. That expands out to the 30 in phase 2. So just make sure that's something you're aware of. A lot of questions about PPE. We've got different levels of PPE, and that can go everything from your face coverings with masks, whether it's a surgical mask, some of the homemade masks that you're seeing out there, and all the way up to N95s, which we have some specific applications for that. Also, a lot of talk and discussions around face shields. We're making some of those ourselves in-house and providing those up to the hospital. We're using them in our screening process. So face shields is another option. And then safety glass gloves, which can be used in conjunction with your mask and your face covering. So, and don't forget about your cleaning crew. As we talk a little bit more about cleaning here later, obviously we've picked up our cleaning frequency, and we've changed some of the type of cleaning materials that were used. So you want to make sure you're protecting your employees the best way possible. If you are doing some of those things, making gloves and safety glasses required, and even looking at face shields in some cases. When we get into our screeners, the idea is our screeners are screening employees before they come into work, and we're clearing them as symptom-free from the COVID-19 signs and symptoms. So with our screeners, we are using advanced PPE, and there's a picture there of Mary who was doing our screening yesterday morning. With that, we are using N95s or surgical masks, depending on how close contact the employees are getting during the screening process. Gloves, disposable lab coats, tight-fitting safety glasses or face shields. So there's just a lot of things to consider with PPE with contact points with your employees. Collaborating with public health. So this is another piece of the governor directive, and we thought it was important to talk through these a little bit as we talk about before we get into our screening process. So we spent a lot of time on this in the early stages, specifically when there wasn't a lot of testing available. We were getting into a lot of questions such as my wife's brother thinks they have a suspected case at their daycare. Should I come into work? So we had quite a few of these pop up in the early weeks. It's died down a little bit as we've been a little more consistent in the Valley with being able to get people tested that truly need to be tested. But I wanted to talk about these a little bit. As you bring employees into your work area, you may start with some of those questions. So for us, we talk about confirmed, suspected, and close contact. Obviously, confirmed is a test was admitted and they confirmed that they tested positive for COVID-19. One that we have a lot of discussion about is suspected. So this we identify kind of into two areas. So one is employees showing signs and symptoms, and they actually administer a test for COVID-19. In that case, we're identifying those employees as suspected COVID-19, or if a healthcare provider ask an employee to go into quarantine because of signs and symptoms without administering the test. So in those cases, we're also treating those individuals as suspected COVID-19. Obviously, we saw quite a few of those in the early stages where there just wasn't enough testing material, testing kits here in the Valley. So when an individual would come in with signs and symptoms, the healthcare professional was saying, we're unable to test you. We think you may or may not have COVID-19. Therefore, we're going to ask you to quarantine for either 7 or 14 days. In that case, we treated those as a suspected case. In our quarantine requirement, it was exactly as if it was an actual confirmed case. And then the next phase of that, again, is, you know, we're trying to keep this stuff out of the workplace as much as possible. So we will question our employees about close contact with either confirmed or suspected cases, including household members. So in our case, if an employee had a household member that was required to quarantine either under confirmed or suspected, we required our employees to actually quarantine under that same requirement. And that also goes with close contact. So again, close contact is face-to-face contact within 6 feet. We had a couple cases with this with our employees where they were, prior to the quarantine in place requirements, they were visiting with some friends, socially, found out 3 or 4 days later that they were being tested for COVID-19. We then quarantined those employees because of close contact with a suspected case. So, you know, like I said earlier, we spent a lot of time talking through these because it did get kind of complicated there in the early stages. It's been much better lately as we've increased the number of people that are able to test. Just trying to encourage you guys as you get more folks back into your workplace, if you haven't already done this, just develop plans for tracking your sick calls and those COVID-related absences. We track this up daily, both sick calls and our employees in quarantine. And it can be a little tricky even with the travel requirements. So make sure you got good plans in place for that. And there's a lot of resources out available to you, whether it's the CDC, the Public Health Department, or the Montana State website. There's one there from CDC that can help provide some guidance. All right, the big one, temperature checks and system screenings. So for us, we define that we break this into 2 different categories. In the directive calls for monitoring your workforce for addictive symptoms. So very early on, like Brian and Ken mentioned, we implemented a passive screening process. So this is indirect monitoring of your employees for signs and symptoms related to COVID-19. We did this through a number of different ways. So that's lobby signage, in all the doors where employees were coming in. We had these questions posted. Obviously, utilized our email communications, internal company websites, talked about them in employee meetings. But just, you know, let our employees know, hey, these are things that you can answer yes for any of these questions. And your employees now refer us to as our 5 questions because they get asked them daily. And we don't like to workplace. So you can work with your supervisor, get it documented in our system, and we'll follow up with each individual employee, make sure that they're complying with the quarantine requirements. So that was what we did very early on with our passive screening. We're still doing a little bit of passive screening with our delivery truck drivers, so FedEx, UPS, some of the folks that are helping us ship parts in or parts out. As they come onto our campus, we're still using a passive screening process with them where we provide them this list of questions and ask that they can answer no to all of those. When the shelter-in-place requirements started, we moved to an active screening process. So this is direct monitoring of our employees and those requiring access to our building to control that access. So we're using the same screening questions, we're just doing it in a method where we get a verbal response from the employee, and at the same time we're monitoring signs and symptoms of them as they're coming in for the screening process. So what does that look like? We've utilized 2 different models. Currently right now at Birch Grove, our machine shop south of the airport, we're using a drive-through model. So as the employees enter our campus, they're actually driving through an area where we've got screeners on site. And there's a picture of our remote screening at main plant, but this is how it currently looks at our site at Birch Grove. And we have some trained folks there, our emergency response team members, who are trained in full PPE to ask those screening questions, make sure that employees coming on the campus answer no to the 5 questions, and that they are symptom-free of COVID-19 signs and symptoms. We already talked about the screeners in full PPE, so the idea and concept here is we don't know yet. We're verifying, therefore we want to have our employees in the highest level of personal protective equipment. Some words of caution on setting up a screening process. Want to make sure you have a method for denying entry. So early on, we had 5 or 6 folks that we denied access due to the screening process. We actually had another one yesterday. So you want to have a method in place for how do you get those folks off your campus or deny them access to your building. For the remote drive-through, or for the drive-through model, it's pretty easy because they just circle back around in their own personal vehicle. We've been able to maintain that social distancing. They don't have to go back through the public that hasn't, or your workforce that hasn't been screened yet. So they just turn around in their vehicle and they exit the campus. When we talk about the remote indoor model, which I'll show you an example of here shortly, you may want to make sure you have at least 2 entry points, or an entry point and an exit point. So the idea and concept again is if you have an employee who's hot, showing signs of symptoms, you don't want to backtrack in through your workforce that hasn't been screened yet. You want to be able to get them out of the screening area in a clean way that they don't go back through that workforce. So, some things to consider, some areas that were a struggle for us that we spent a lot of time on, kind of firming up. Big one's time of operation. Active screening can be labor intensive, does require resources that we had to pull from the manufacturing floor. So obviously, you don't want to be screening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You want to screen when it's necessarily time to screen, and really condense those hours down to as much as possible. When we first started out, we were doing 4 hours in the morning, and now we're cutting to 2 45-minute blocks, and we're able to get everybody in a timely manner and screen and release the pressure on our screeners. Off-hour screening is another big one. You may have people throughout the day that need to come into your facilities. Maybe it's delivery truck drivers, maybe it's a vendor, maybe in your case it might be members of the public. So how do you screen those folks? And again, we want to make sure that we're screening 100% of the folks that come through the building. We don't want to spend 45 minutes twice a day in the morning screening 280 employees and then just allow somebody who wants to come in and get something from their desk to come in unscreened. So off-hour screening is a big one. For us, it's a call-out process procedure, and we really make our folks that come in off hours feel really guilty about it so that they don't do it again the next day. We really encourage everybody to come in during those screening times. We put a lot of time and energy into manning those screening times, and we're really asking our employees and our folks that need to come in and support operations that come in during those screening times. And then obviously for many of you, you may have to have a method for screening the members of the public, and probably recommend some kind of passive screening process. Temperature screening, it does mention temperature checks as one of the methods for screening employees. We spend a lot of time, not only as a business unit, but as a company, discussing what this potentially could look like. How do we do it? I'll be honest, it's very, very difficult in Montana with our weather extremes to check temperatures with a no-check thermometer outdoors. Just because of the weather environment and the sensitivity of those no-touch thermometers. For example, we did the testing. You can walk out to your vehicle in the parking lot, walk back in, and it takes my forehead approximately 2 minutes to get back up to its original temperature. So some challenges with the no touch. So if you're not screening indoors, if you don't have a kind of a holding area, those no touch thermometers can be pretty tricky. I've heard that some of the businesses in the valley are checking the temperature on their elbow or inside their forearm after employees come in and they take off a coat or jacket. That's one option. But just, word of caution on the temperature screens. It can be very difficult with the current technology of no-touch thermometers. Obviously, you want to use no-touch because you don't want to get in the process of, doing the forehead type scan thermometers, and then, do one employee, then have to come back and do another one without disinfecting. So if you can, try to get to the no-touch. But there are some pitfalls there. So, active screening indoors. This is the method we've gone to here at our main plant site. A lot of details on this slide here. Again, the main reason we went to bringing it back indoors is we wanted to try to utilize some of our folks that are working from home remotely in the screening process so that we could relieve some of the pressure on our manufacturing folks who are ERTs. So we were able to take a large lunchroom that we didn't have a need for because of the reduction in workforce. And we set this up into a remote screening process where we have employees basically come in with 6-foot social distancing marks on there. They come into a remote screener who's at home. Both Brian and Ken have helped out with this a ton. And the screening process with those screening questions are asked from somebody at home. You get the employee cleared. They proceed to a table where they pick up their face mask for the day and a band. We band all our employees so that it gives our employees freedom to move in and out of the buildings throughout the day after they've gone through the screening process. So they only have to be screened once. And the benefit we had with moving this indoors is we were allowed to utilize some technology with IR testing equipment for our temperature checks. So this is the example there in the middle is the one we're currently using at our site here off of West Reserve. And then we are using the gun model at Birch Grove in the drive-through process, and actually had some great success with that. And the benefit of these cameras is they're available to detect different parts of the body versus just the forehead. So we can focus in on whether it's the eyes, the nose, or the mouth, and get a really good reading on body temperature. And we've had huge success with this. The only downside to this is the technology. It's a little bit hard to come by right now because everybody's out trying to order this stuff, and it can be a little bit pricey. There's some price ranges there, about $9,000 to $12,000 for these units. We're using the FLIR model. There's also some other models out there. FLIR.com has some pretty good equipment out there. And we're going to be doing some work here to kind of make this more permanent process for our employees before they come in. Sanitation, disinfection in common and high traffic areas. So we'll try to keep employees out that can't come in, screen them to make sure they don't come inside the symptoms. And then once they're in there, how do we keep workstations clean behind them as they're going about their daily activities? So we beefed up our cleaning process quite a bit. Kudos to our facilities group and our janitorial folks. They're doing an outstanding job coming up with new processes and new procedures to help us comply with some of the recommendations that we're seeing from the CDC and the company on our cleaning processes. Some of the things that we learned along the way, obviously we've had a few questions from our employees about what we're doing. So we've actually published our cleaning schedules. We've got a very detailed schedule by hour of what our janitorial staff's doing. We publish that to our employees so that they're aware of what's going on. We already talked about closing some areas not in use. And again, it can be a strain on your folks who are doing the cleaning process. So we don't want to clean a location or a site that doesn't need to be cleaned. So we're identifying those through signage, saying, hey, this station's already been cleaned. If you use the station, let us know so that we can come back in and disinfect after you. And as we move forward, we're looking at some self-cleaning stations, so we'll always have the ability to go in, grab some wipe down areas that they'd use, whether it's a conference room, office area, or a desk. For our manufacturing ops, we've been fortunate enough that we have a significant amount of isopropyl alcohol, IPA, on site because we use that to clean our product before we ship out to the customers anyways. And we've just beefed that up with COVID-19. Our manufacturing folks are wiping down areas upon arrival before they depart. If they have new folks coming to their work area for support reasons, whether it's engineering, management. So we are continually wiping down areas in the manufacturing side to make sure it's clean and safe and disinfected. Obviously, a bunch of work on hand sanitizer, hand washing. We've got so much hand sanitizer around this building. If the building's on fire, it's because of all the hand sanitizer we have spread out throughout the building. We've got it everywhere. Hand washing, posting, in the break rooms, in the restrooms, hand washing recommendations to the CDC. And then obviously the high traffic areas and touch points. Again, this is, we got a lot of feedback from our employees, a lot of feedback from the other sites. We actually went out and did audits to watch what we were doing in the workplace and just trying to identify all these common touch points areas and then making sure we had those included in our disinfection and sanitation plans. Printers, vending machines, obviously the restrooms, break rooms. doors, shared equipment, vehicles? Do you have people sharing motor vehicles, forklifts, drinking fountains? The list goes on and on. Some of these things we actually removed or shut down. Things like in our coffee stations, we removed the lids, we removed the swizzle sticks, we removed all these things where there was potential for employees to have those touch points. So all things for you guys to consider. And sorry, I went back. And then lastly, I'll kind of hand it over to either Brian or Ken on some things here with the IPA and how we hope maybe we can help you all out with getting materials to help with the cleaning process.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, one of the approved cleaning supplies for COVID-19 is isopropyl alcohol, which we obviously have plenty of. We buy it by the 55-gallon drum. So as a service to the business community, we wanted to offer through the Chamber of Commerce some of this up for public use. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you good.
We can hear you.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. So we're going to deliver about 400 bottles, 25-ounce bottles to Chamber of Commerce tomorrow. And all we ask for employees or employers that need this is that they make a donation to a local charity of their choice, and really try to reserve this for those of you that are employing people that do not have access or are having trouble getting these cleaning supplies. So with that, we'll open it up to any questions that any of you may have.
Brian, Joe here. I see you've got a question from Tia Robin, who's asking, how are you identifying the high-risk employees or vulnerable family members?
Yeah, very good question. Essentially what we're doing is employee screening. So we are still doing active employee screening. So the questions that Chris was showing earlier, we ask every employee every morning when they enter the facility. And as we begin to phase other employees back in, we're having our individual managers work with each of those individuals to discuss risks and concerns that they have about returning to the workplace if they are not already actively returning to the workplace. So really a one-on-one conversation with the manager and the employees. I think that's very important.
Yeah, this is Mary. Just to add to that, the beginning of identifying high-risk employees and vulnerable family members, like Brian said, it was a very high one-on-one individual conversation. And then, like Chris mentioned earlier, it's very important that you set up some sort of system to track that information and ultimately categorize. And so that's something that we, have done with our workforce.
Yeah, I've got a question to the team there. This is Joe again. And by the way, with anybody there in the listening audience, if you'd like to ask a question, just go to your toolbar there, your menu bar. In the center of it is the words Q&A. And if you click on that, you'll be able to type in a question for the panel. So maybe while people are thinking about that, how about talk about sort of the employee reaction and how you deal with that. Maybe that's an HR question, but I would imagine some people are okay with that and so on, and others feel it's, a bit of an invasive process. And how do you sort of manage working through sort of the HR side of that and just the sort of getting in the space of your employees and the various reactions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, our main message, even at the beginning of the conversation, is employee health and safety. And the less people we bring on site that are, are non-essential to actually, physically being able to do their job away from the site, keeps that environment safer. And I think that our workforce has a deep appreciation for that. And then really then it goes back to that open dialogue with your workforce, that those one-on-one conversations addressing people's concerns. And I think, we opened a lot of opportunity for our workforce to provide us feedback, and they were able to see things that we could actually implement in the workplace that were their ideas. So, just a reminder to listen to them. Often those ideas come from them that, we've put in place.
Great, thanks for that answer. Kim Coles has a question. Will you be able to share this presentation? This is amazing information, would be super helpful in creating our plan for reentry. And Kim, this has been recorded, or is being recorded, and thanks to Applied Materials, they're agreeing to have this available. It'll be posted on the Kalispell Chamber's YouTube channel, and we'll be pushing it out in our communications and via social media for if you weren't able to catch all of it, or perhaps if you want to refer it or to review later in detail, you'll be able to see the whole presentation, including the slides and all of the narrative that went along with that. Okay. Here's a question from Jenny West. Do you have any recommendations and or sources for lower priced contactless thermometers that is under $500?
Sure. Well, Walmart sells one for about $12 that works just fine. Maybe Chris, do you have some specific recommendations for the versions we've been using?
We used a Braun type thermometer, and again, we were lucky enough that we were able to get these prior to COVID-19 showing up, so we got them a pretty good rate. But they're currently going for about $60 right now on Amazon.com.
Yeah, great.
What we found is we've tested numerous different types of no touch, and kind of to Brian's point, there's not a huge difference in the sensitivity from the $12 version to the $60 version. They all have their limitations. They all have some things that make them difficult with our weather conditions. But yeah, if you can stay indoors and you can get the temperature up to a normal reading, they all work pretty well.
Great. Any other questions out there? So this has really been excellent. Maybe Brian, I'll throw it over to you and your team for a close, and then I'll wrap up here.
Sure.
I've got one more comment I just wanted to throw out there, Brian, was a lot of companies obviously have closed during this time, and we had the fortunate opportunity for what our business is to be considered an essential business. And with that, in fact, we're actually increasing our business and supporting future growth here in our community. So we have quite a few openings right now at this time that are with our staffing partner, LC Staffing. So just wanted a quick plug. If you know somebody who's looking for work, please send them to LC Staffing. Mention Applied Materials has openings. We have several different opportunities.
Very good shameless plug, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as you work through this, don't be afraid to reach out to us through the chamber or any of us that are on this call. If you know us personally, we certainly are willing to help. We understand that, especially smaller businesses, you don't really have the resources, or maybe even a group of people that can, spend an hour a day like we do and work through this kind of thing. And most importantly, stay in touch with your employees. Remember, you're in this for the long haul, so you want your employees to really feel that they're valued during this time, especially if they're really good employees, and you want them to stay here. And a lot of times, I'm sure small businesses especially get thinking about the bottom line, and it's tough to make ends meet right now. But on top of that, you don't want to end up in a situation where I was talking to a guy this morning who builds steel buildings in the valley, and he can't find laborers to come to work right now. You don't want to be in that situation. So if you have good people, you want to hang on to them, and you want to do everything you can to make them feel valued, and think about deeper than just having them show up and get a paycheck. Think about, things that really may be bothering them relative, to their concerns about the situation and their health. So And I don't think that there are any wrong answers in terms of what you're doing to try to protect your employees and your customers. You know, the most important thing is to do something and get out there and, you know, stay in front of it and just have a game plan lined out and have it in your mind laid out how you're going to guide through this and work through this rather than trying to do it on the fly.
Great, that's great advice, and we appreciate that. And Brian, thanks to you and your entire team for the presentation today, and for your generous offer of these bottles of propylene alcohol disinfectant for small businesses in their workforce, and for that great tie-in with, we've got sort of a COVID giving day coming up on May 5th. So we're proposing to hand these out from the chamber starting at 8:30 this Friday. So with your generous donation, anybody who's listening to this, you can spread the word. It will be available to small businesses starting this Friday at 8:30, and we'll hand them out till they're gone. And we're here at 15 Depot Park, Kalispell, right at the northeast corner of Center and Main. And Brian, again, thanks to you and your entire team for the great work you're doing and for your generosity and offering your expertise to all the members of the Kalispell Chamber and all employers throughout the Flathead Valley. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thanks again. We'll continue to work through all this and hope to bring you more programming like this to the Kalispell Chamber versus this webinar format as we fight our way through this pandemic and work towards economic recovery here in the Flathead. Everybody have a great day. Thanks again to Brian, to you and your team at Applied Materials.
Thanks, Joe.
Have a great day. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for having us.